Encourage you to be turning with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We are still in our study of spiritual things, and we are in part 3. This is lesson 10, and the title of this lesson is Surrendering to Grace. You know, one of the things that people struggle with in our world is the understanding of God's grace. And it would take another lesson or two to really get down to explaining the difficulties that people have in our world when it comes to thinking about grace. But there are those who look at the idea of grace as it doesn't matter what I do, that God's going to forgive me. And that's God's grace. And I can live just as sinful as I so desire, and it be all right. Well, the scripture tells us that we need to be those who are obedient. And grace does not abound if we sin, because we can come to that point that we can fall away from God. Those that teach the idea that we cannot fall away from God teach the idea that grace covers everything. And that is a unbiblical ideology that they promote. But for most people, as it notes here in our outline, it says one of the most challenging, difficult acts of surrender for the typical Christian is to surrender to God's grace, or to surrender to grace. You know, we predominantly have the idea that we receive what we work for. But grace is that blessing that God has given it to us. And when it comes to salvation, now that does not negate the reality that we have certain things to do, and that's obedience to God. And because we are obedient to God, we receive God's grace, because we don't deserve salvation. We don't deserve what God has done by sending his son to this world and die on the cross for us. But he did, because he loved us. And grace is that which is available to every person that's ever been born into this world. Sadly, many, they don't want God's grace, I guess, because they won't do what one needs to do to receive it. It's kind of like the old story that I've always told. If I had $1 million and I put it up here on this table and I said that $1 million is yours, and you said, oh, great, that $1 million is mine. Well, the thing is, you got to get up, walk up here, and get it. I'm not bringing it to you. I'm not giving it to you. I'm not forcing it on you like some teach grace. But you got to come get it. And that's the way we receive grace. The grace is there that we don't deserve. But yet, as people in our world today, it is very simple to think about, you know, we need to really work toward salvation, and we cannot. There's not enough good in us, enough good things for us to do to earn our salvation. And as it notes in this first part of this lesson, some people think that, well, I've done all this for God and God owes me. Well, God doesn't owe us anything, because God paid the price with his son that we might have a hope of eternal life. In our outline, it says, in the modern concept of the person, no one should feel any sense of inferiority. And we are not inferior. We're all God's people. And the thing about it is that everyone has the availability of God's grace, no matter who they are. They just have to get it, utilize it, and it's paid for. That's what gets me is God's grace is paid for. But some of these ideologies that stem back to Gnosticism and the ideal of the Nicolaitans and all of those is that they've got to do something for it. I've been to I've been to a lot of funerals, so we talk about funerals. I've been to some funerals where somebody would get up and they would say how good this person was and all the things that they did in life. And, they did good here and they did good there, but they never become a Christian. They never did accept God's grace. And they're usually the ones that promote this idea that God's grace just covers everything. You don't have to do anything to receive it. And yet, knowing the individual, you kind of decide that you might ought to go up and see who's in the casket, make sure it's the right funeral. That's kind of sad, but it's true. It's very true. We cannot work our way into receiving such things. The next heading says, in no way does this lesson suggest that any person, regardless of situation, circumstance, or heritage, should be denied respect, kindness, and consideration. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the peace of God that is given to us in our other lesson this morning. But the thing about it is that we need to be those who love others and help others find God's grace. The heart of this lesson centers on the struggle of self-perception. Typically, a person wants to be accepted on the basis of merit of being, personal achievement. But God's accepts us because we're His children, because He loves us. It notes here our common conviction: I merit your consideration, I earn your respect, I deserve opportunity. And there's a lot of things that we could look at according to that. But even being obedient to God is not earning it. It's doing what He told us to do because He loved us and we love Him. And that's kind of what this gets out to be. The next heading says, personal attitude of worth, merit, and deservedness that are commonly imposed on people are easily imposed on God. And it notes here about making a bargain. I've been with people that were in dire straits, maybe ill or hurt or whatever it may be, bad situations, and they would be pleading to God, God, if you'll allow me to get through this, I'll never forsake you. I'll be obedient. I'll do everything that you want me to do. What usually happens in that setting when it's over? Yeah, they forget quickly. It kind of fades after the situation is over. So we need to remember that there is no bargaining with God. He's already done His part. We need to do our part. And I consider that a great blessing, that He sent His only begotten Son to die on that cross for us. Going on down on our outline, it says the Corinthian Christians and Paul, and I'll let you guys look up all these passages that note the Corinthians, Christians, having a struggle with respecting Paul. Well, now we have to also remember that Paul had persecuted the Christians diligently, and they were afraid. They were fearful of Paul. But after a bit, they kind of got past that. Of course, that was when he was Saul of Tarsus. We go back and understand that. It notes here, it says, their attitude created pressure that forced Paul to defend himself. In 1 Corinthians 6, going down to verse 1, I'd like for us to back up and look at that quickly. 2 Corinthians 6, starting there in verse 1. It says, in working together with him, we also urge you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, all the acceptable time I listened to you, and on the day of salvation I helped you. Behold, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Giving no cause for offense in anything, so that the ministry will not be discredited. But in everything, commending ourselves as servants of God, in much endurance, in afflictions, in hardships, in distress, in beatings, in imprisonments, in tumult, in labors, in sleeplessness, in hunger, in purity, in knowledge, in patience, in kindness, in the Holy Spirit, in genuine love, in the word of the truth, in the power of God, by the weapon of righteousness for the right hand and the left, by glory and dishonor, by evil report and good report, regarded as deceivers and yet true, as unknown yet well known, as dying yet behold, we live, as punished yet not put to death, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many riches, as having nothing yet possessing all things. It was necessary for Paul to reveal things about himself that he did not wish to discuss, but in essence, we understand that there was a struggle. Now, when we get over to chapter 12, there were those that were boasting because of the miraculous manifestations that they had received. And Paul, they were kind of looking down on in some instances, but Paul did not place himself in a role of superiority. He didn't say, look how great I am. You know, it's kind of like the fellow that comes along and says, you know, you've got to look up to me because I have a PhD. Well, you know, that's great. And I'm thankful that people have that opportunity to have such a high education. And there's certainly nothing wrong with education. And I'll tell our viewing audience, get all the education you can, but also make it applicable, be able to apply it. Besides, I have a PhD. It's out there by the well house right now. I seen it as I left the house a while ago, and I don't want to apply it. It's called a post hole digger. But it's out there. Linda won't run it, so there you go. I tell you. I don't even know if Linda can pick it up because it's got steel handles in it. You know, it does a good job. It works well, but it'll work you over. But the thing is that Paul, even though he was superior, he had met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and we'll get into that here in just a moment. But if we are blessed with an ability, don't think yourself better than somebody else, because we're all the same. We're all just humans. We all do what we need to do to glorify God. Now, this was not an attempt to exalt himself, but to challenge the Corinthian Christians to examine their own claims and attitudes. And that's what it's getting here. We've received the grace of God, and the things that God has blessed us with, we use it for his glory. So let's look here at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning there in verse 1. In the first question, it says, some of the Corinthian Christians used claims of visions and revelation to declare their spiritual superiority. Paul said what was necessary, but not profitable. Verse 1, boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable. But I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Now, Paul revealed a personal experience that he did not wish to use, but he is in this passage. Its uselessness was found in the fact that they would understand Paul's point, not because of the experience, but the experience of that specialness that he received. They clamored to have spiritual superiority because they had these miraculous manifestations of visions and revelations. And that was a good thing. But in essence, he's telling us here as we look at number 2, not to think too much of it. In number 2, it says Paul discussed an experience that he preferred not to discuss. The situation, their claim of superiority because of visions and revelation made it necessary. And in regard to time, not incident, did this experience happen? And it notes what happened, verse 2. I like it the way he starts this out here in verse 2. I know a man. I know a man. Now, he's talking about himself, but he says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in body, I do not know, or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Such a man was caught up into the third heaven. Well, this happened 14 years prior to the writing of Second Corinthians. And he was allowed into what is noted here as the third heaven. We will see down in verse 4, it notes that he was caught up into paradise. And there's a lot of discussion of what the third heaven is. And everybody's got an opinion, and it's just like noses. Everybody's got one, we going to conclude that verse 4 says, when I was caught up into paradise. And that's what I know about it, without making any assumptions or those kinds of things. The thing about it was that this was a place that living humans did not go to. This was something special that happened to Paul. And you think about Paul on that road to Damascus, that would have been kind of shocking, everything that happened there. I mean, here he is, he's going along, he's got it on his mind, he's got a paper in his hand that he's going to go persecute these Christians. And then this bright light come around him. And who did he meet? He met Jesus on the road. Jesus had already been dead for quite some time, in essence. And he meets the Lord. And that would be kind of a unique thing. And then being taken up into this third heaven, or this paradise, would have been enlightening. Could we use that word? Very enlightening. In number 3, it says, where did Paul go and what did he hear? Verse 3. And I know how such a man, whether in body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which a man is not permitted to speak. Well, Paul went to paradise, heard these words, and understood the things that he needed to be doing. And he was set on a mission. And Paul fulfilled that great mission. In number 4, it says some Corinthian Christians would have paraded such an experience. What was Paul's attitude regarding this experience? Verses 5 and 6 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, on behalf of such a man, I will boast. But on my own behavior, I will not boast, except in regard to my weakness. For if I do wish to boast, I will not be fooled. For I was speaking the truth. But I refrain from this so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears in me. Well, these Corinthian brethren, they were boasting because they had the ability to have visions and revelations, and they were pretty much saying, look how great I am, and I'm superior. And if you go back and or go ahead here and study verse 13, or chapter 13 go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. The problem was that they were making themselves ultra important, because they had these miraculous manifestations. And that was a problem. And in essence, Paul is saying, look, I went up to the third heaven and you didn't. You didn't make it up there. But I did. I seen Jesus on the road to Damascus. But I'm not going to be boastful about it. Doesn't make me any better or any different. It is just that blessing that he received so that he could fulfill the mission that God had set out for him. Paul placed no special spiritual significance on himself because of his experience. He found his experience significant on his weakness, not the incredible experience. And I would suggest that the weakness partly was because of his lack of knowledge and his persecution of the church, of Christians at the time. Uh, in number 5, it says, this was an unusual, incredible, unique experience. To protect Paul from the temptation of exalting himself, what happened to Paul? And in verse 7, it says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Now, again, there are a multitude of ideas of what the thorn in the flesh is or was. Some people would note that it was a medical problem. Some people noted the idea that it was a problem with literally a thorn in his flesh that couldn't get out. And I don't know about you guys, but I've had thorns, and I kind of think of it this kind of like that is the way he's talking about this is kind of like a splinter. Everybody's had splinters. You know, you get a splinter in there and you don't get it out, and what does it start doing? Festers up. Yeah, it gets infected and festers up, and it just hurts. And every time you touch it, it hurts, and it's just constant. Well, I'm gonna give you a little medical advice here. If you get a splinter in your finger and it don't come out, get you some of that old black salve, put on there. Y'all remember, any of y'all ever see that black salve that Mama used to put on us? Yeah, come in a little tube about so big, and put it on it and draw it out. I can't remember what the name of that stuff is, but we always called it black salve. Well, there wasn't any black salve for this problem. The key factor with this passage is this thorn in the flesh was to keep him from exalting himself. It was in essence to keep him humble. And it was a messenger of Satan. And it was something that tormented him all along. And we don't know exactly what it was. And we can conjecture many, many things, what it might have been. But I think the key in this passage is that it was so that he wouldn't think too much of himself. Keeps us humble. And sometimes we all need something that keeps us humble. Number 6, what was Paul's reaction? Let's look at verse 8. It says, concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. Well, he was wanting this struggle, this thorn, to be removed. And from Paul's perspective, the thorn negatively affected his work and his service to the Lord. And in some ways, we can understand those things. There's struggles that we all have that Satan lays upon us that keeps us from doing everything that we want to do for God. And we have to endure those things and just keep pushing forward, taking care of that. Well, he wanted it taken away, but it never was, because it was what he needed. And we see that in verse 9. That's number 7. It says, how did the Lord answer Paul? And it says, and he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Well, the Lord didn't take the struggle away, the thorn out. It was not Paul's spiritual best interest that it be removed. He needed to be humbled. And, you know, we think about Paul. Paul was in a very powerful position before the Damascus road. And some have said that he was probably on the path to being high priest. And he was very wealthy. He had lots of things. And he gave all of that up for Jesus. And it wouldn't have taken very much with that kind of a background and knowing that you'd been up to the third heaven and you'd met Jesus on the road to have made a whole lot more of you than you should have. But it was by the grace of God that he continued with this, and God's grace was enough. I've known of individuals who, how would I say this, full of themselves. Look how great I am. And I remember years ago, the comment was, well, that fellow's a big man in the brotherhood. Well, I used to be a big man in the brotherhood, and I lost about 50 pounds. So, and a lot of those guys were big men in the brotherhood, and they needed to lose 50 pounds. But anyway, hey, we're all the same. Some people are blessed with abilities, and other people aren't, and we do the very best we can. But I think what he's getting at a lot of here is just being humble and humbly serving God. God's grace was sufficient for what Paul needed. In number 8, it says, when Paul understood why he experienced the weakness, what was his attitude? And this is in verse 10, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, therefore I am well content with weakness, with insults, with distress, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He was not focused on this struggle, this thorn that Satan had placed upon him. In fact, he found joy in this weakness produced by the thorn. He wanted the thorn to remain so that the power of Christ could live in him. And whatever struggles that we have, we need to be thankful for those struggles because it makes us stronger. Run into a situation not too long ago that an individual had went through a difficult time. And I thought to myself after I'd visited with them about that struggle, that, looking at their life, that struggle just made them stronger. And that's the way we need to look at things. It makes us stronger, whatever struggle that we do face. Number 9, it says, what was sufficient for Paul? And this takes us back to verse 9. And it says, for he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. God's grace, goodness, or grace was sufficient. He didn't need any more. He needed to depend on God. And we need to do that. We have this tendency, and I have it just like everybody else, that I can do it myself. I don't need God's help. And only when it gets really, really bad do I want to go ask God's help. But we need to rely on God. He's the one in charge. He's the one that gives us the grace. He's the one that helps us through these things. Number 10. How is the Lord's power perfected? Well, there in verse 9 that we just read, God's power reaches maturity, perfection, completeness in our human weakness. We can be powerful in God and for God because God, not because of us. We need to be those who are dependent on God. In our outline, there it says, God is powerful in us when we are 100% dependent on God. And we need to let loose and let God's will care for our needs. When we are struggling, we need to remember that God is there for us. He has given us grace. The blessing of grace is that he sent his son, number 1. And secondly, is that when we do falter, God knew we was going to struggle, knew we was going to falter, that he give us opportunity to be able to ask forgiveness of those sins. We studied about that over in 1 John chapter 1. It notes that we fear 100% at the mercy of anyone. We would never advise anyone to place themselves in that situation. Put yourselves in the hand of God. However, we are 100% dependent on God's mercy. Spiritual maturity occurs to the extent we place confidence in God's goodness. So we resist putting 100% of God's grace. We're hurting ourselves. We need to rely on God because God is the one that will truly take care of us. He is our security. So, Lord willing, next Sunday morning we'll be looking at this, some of this again, and we'll continue at that time.